So we are on our broker strategy call. This is the second one for January for the Heart of Atlanta. And one of the reasons we do this for you guys is to make sure that, number one, this is your class, not mine. This is your opportunity. If there's something, a burning question or a situation that you're having out on the sidewalk that you are scratching your head like, I thought this. I had someone call this weekend. They went to a class or a group session, mastermind or something, and someone reminded this person that in Georgia, we do not have fiduciary responsibility. We have responsibility of care. And that person was a longtime agent. And just as I was shocked to hear that, because for some reason, I was thinking about pre-license. I never heard anybody say that we have fiduciary, but everything we read on Inman News or Realtor.com uses the word fiduciary. There are certain states that have a fiduciary responsibility. And if you want to know more about that, make sure that you are a member of the Wiseman YouTube channel. And he does little blurbs every month on different things that come up in our industry. And he does a whole thing on, we do not have a responsibility of fiduciary. We have reasonable care. So I wanted to just throw that out again, because after this will be 28 years for me in July, and I heard it maybe 3 years ago, maybe five. And when Seth said it, I'm like, what are you talking about? And so I listened to that, and there were tons of people on that call that felt the same way. So if you're scratching your head right now going, wait, what? Yeah, I had the same expression on my face as well. So with that being said, let's jump right in. In 2024, or every year, I should say, in January, our contracts will change in the FMLS and MLS system, if you're using that, or Remind is what we call it now. And then if you're with Keller Williams, of course, we have Command and DocuSign, where the contracts are uploaded by our MCA. I usually encourage the office to get those uploaded as quickly as possible so they're available to you. Now, when the contracts are updated, there will be grammatical errors. There will be numbering errors, things of that nature. So when you see things like that, feel free to contact them direct. You can contact your broker, and we will send that information to the contract committee, because they are human. The people that create this for us are human, and mistakes are made. So sometimes our changes are just grammatical and spelling error changes, or renumbering changes, or relettering, that type of thing. Today, all I'm going to do is go over the main parts that most of the people on this call today will deal with. If you are a commercial agent or you do a lot of commercial, I am not going to go over the commercial changes. But if you will go into your documents, you will have a form change list, and it will tell you the commercial changes, okay? And if we need a class that delves into that more, we can dedicate that to you. All right. We also have a GAR form table of content that breaks this down into a series of numbers, which is what I'm going to do today. And that's also procured by our GAR Contract Committee. And of course, our attorney council, they meet each month, and our council is Wiseman Law. We now have over 600 forms. You will never touch all 600, I guarantee you, in your career. However, every time we have a lawsuit, every time we have a change in our industry, there's probably a form that's going to be added or subtracted. We also have some new special steps, very few, but anytime you need to write a special step, then before you start thinking about how to write this, because chances are if you write it on your own and you've not done it before, you are going to miss some things. So I've always taught special steps like this. If it doesn't say what, when, where, how, what, when, where, how, what, when, where, how, and what happens if, you probably have not written a good special step. The index that you have here will go over scenarios that typically happen in our industry, and we already have an attorney who has written the special step for us. So always check this index first, and then if you need to write your own special stip, or if you need to take one that's on here and doctor it a little bit, that's okay as well. But always ask yourself those questions, okay? All right, so let's start with the consumer brochure. Consumer brochures, and this is CB 13. This consumer brochure added smart home technology. We live in a world of smart homes, smart phones, smart everything. And one of the things that we've been talking about for quite some time, but it was not in our brochure, is that when you are the listing agent or the buyer's agent, you should always check and make sure that all devices, fobs, passwords, remote controls, anything that might be in the home that has to have a password of some sort, of some type of login, you need to make sure that that information is being turned over to the new buyer and that the seller has disconnected from all of those devices, as well as any third parties they may have given it to. Maybe there's a kid in college now that is not home, but might have the password to those type of things. That's very important for privacy. You will know that our contracts have also been updated to mention this, and that the seller must disengage from any of these devices when they turn them over, and that we are not held harmless as agents in the event someone's watching them after they close, or controls their doors or their thermostat, or whatever the case may be. So it's very important that when you are working with buyers and sellers, that you give them a packet of consumer brochures. What I have always suggested is that you take the consumer brochures, put them in a zip file on your favorite device, and then when you are going over your brokerage engagements, whether it be listing or buyer, then you give this zip file to that customer or client. Any questions about this section? Also, if you are not using the consumer brochures, if you're not in the practice of doing it, I would get into the practice, as we will talk more about the changes and why I'm saying this. All right, so let's dive into Series 100, the brokerage engagements. Most of the things here, sentences were changed. I've highlighted here. You know what I didn't do? Hold on one second. Let me see if I can do this real quick for you. Let me stop sharing for just a quick second. Sorry about that. I forgot to put a little handout in here for you. That would make life easier for you, wouldn't it? I see your face. Short. Let's do that. I bet you that's going to help you out tremendously. I was trying to get on here early enough to have all this ready, but out to presentation. Can someone confirm that that went through, please? Yes, no, maybe?
Yes, we got it.
Okay, beautiful. Thank you, Carrington. All right, so the exclusive seller brokerage engagement, along with any brokerage engagement. So if it says seller brokerage engagement, tenant brokerage engagement, listing brokerage engagement, buyer brokerage engagement, the same changes apply on all the forms, okay, as far as any kind of renumbering or sentence changes, things of that nature. But what's new in this seller brokerage engagement agreement, in light of all the lawsuits that have been going around in certain states, Georgia has 2 right now. I've not heard anything new about those 2 lawsuits. So if someone does have any insight on that, please feel free to unmute and enlighten all of us. I try to stay on top of the latest and greatest because it does affect the way that we do business. In the seller brokerage engagement agreement, under Section 4A of that contract, it now describes that the commission to be paid to the seller broker. So if you're a listing agent, that would be you. You're going to put the percentage, the dollar amount, or other. But 4B is the newest, latest, and greatest, which our contracts have always, due to BRETA, have implied this, but now it's clearer to say you can or cannot offer a co-op commission. Okay, so B says seller directs the seller's broker to pay or not to pay. So can somebody that's willing to unmute and tell us, have you run into any wait what questions on this listing agreement? And if not, that's okay. Anybody? Bueller? Bueller? No, me either. Not yet. I've said it. I've explained it. And so far, the seller said, well, why wouldn't I offer? So far, now I know there's going to be one, but so far it has been, sure, you know, I still want to do that. That doesn't make any sense. I want people to look at my house and so on and so forth. Carrington, you're raising your hand. Unmute and tell us your thoughts.
Question about this. So if the seller agrees that they're going to pay a 6% commission and they decide to share 2% of that with the buyer broker, are we at all able to share 3% of it? Is there something that is against us, you know, instead of taking the 4, actually giving them an additional percentage?
I don't think there's a problem with that. No, there's not been any discussion that it has to be a certain way. You would just discuss that with the seller, because if the seller is agreeing to a total of 6, they probably do not care how that's split. So if the seller says, I only want to give 2 and you can take 4, you know, then you need to just let them know, you know, would you be opposed to me giving 3 to the other side and just have that conversation? Answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. And then also, the other part that is new is if there are any exceptions. Right below other, you'll see right here where it says exceptions. So if there's any type of exception, then you would put that. I can't think of one off the top of my head right now in this scenario. So I can't. An exception might be in the event the person doesn't show it, you know, you could change that, but we took that out of the contract. So why they put exceptions here for you to write it back in there, because you know someone's going to do that, I have no idea. I think the key here is that our contract committee wanted to make sure that we were very clear that we practice in a way that commission is discussed and the seller has the right to say, I do want to pay or I do not want to pay. That is really what's important about this section. All right, and then obviously everything on the first page are lines that we fill in and boxes that we check, and then the rest of the contract goes into more detail about it. So at the end of the day, this is basically saying 4B, where we put in the numbers, 4B then explains that we're going to advertise that co-op commission or no commission in our FMLS or Georgia MLS system. Georgia MLS and FMLS have always had that ability to not offer anything, as many of you found out in 2020 when people were standing in line to buy homes and builders were saying, hey, your buyer can come buy my new construction, but I'm not going to pay you. We all experienced that a little bit in 2020. So now things are a little clearer to further explain about the commission. In this section, it also mentions that a commission unless cooperating broker has negotiated and executed with the seller's co-op commission agreement. 258 is that co-op commission agreement. We have always had this form. So if you're confused about what you're being offered before you even make an offer, you can send over, this is to be used prior to showing to make sure that there is a commission. Or in the event there's no commission, you may want to send this over to the listing agent to say, would you consider paying me X amount? This is another form that you could use. FIRPTA. Many of you probably don't pay too much attention to FIRPTA. This is something I've worked with for quite some time. FIRPTA is an affidavit letting a foreign national know that when they sell their property, they may, under the IRS code, have to pay some type of tax, some additional tax. Right now, FERPTA is about 15%. When I started working with foreign nationals, it was about 10. I believe it's either 15 or 16 now. So if you are working with a foreign national, meaning they don't live in the United States, they have purchased property here, they have now decided to sell it, they may be subject to additional taxes on top of whatever Georgia taxes. All right. Now, if you are working with someone who is a foreign national, it is important for you to let the closing attorney know that this contract is based on a foreign national transaction so that they will be prepared to discuss those taxes with your client. So don't forget to do that and put that as part of your system. Now let's jump over to F110, which is the exclusive buyer brokerage engagement. Again, we are also talking about commissions. I've highlighted here that the buyer acknowledges that neither the seller nor the seller's broker are obligated to pay any commission to the broker. So it's important that when you're working with a buyer, you want to make sure that you let them know there might be an opportunity, or I don't even know if I want to call it an opportunity or situation, that when I show a property, it will not have a co-op compensation. And if that happens, then buyer, you're going to be the person paying that commission. So that's a conversation, and it's also an ongoing discussion with our lending industry, because if the buyer, let's say they're an FHA buyer and they are just barely getting in the home with their down payment, or maybe they're doing down payment assistance and now they have to pay you, that could be an issue. So a couple of ways that we've been doing it before all of this became hubbub was rolling it into the price of the home, trying to see if we can negotiate that with the seller first. My advice would be always to tell that buyer, I'm always going to try to negotiate that with the seller first. Think about those of you that have sold a for sale by owner. There's not a commission that is typically offered. So therefore you would negotiate with the authorization to show an unlisted property with that seller first before having to go back to your buyer. Has anybody had any issue with the buyer's agreement yet?
I won't say that I had an issue, but I had my first opportunity to discuss difference in what is advertised and what my charges are as an agent.
Okay.
And so I'm looking for, this just happened. The
Okay.
commission is 2.5. I'm wanting 3. So I'm stuck. So, I mean, I know the language. Now it's just about using the script and how do we go about it to the next step? Do I even say, okay, give me the other 0.5%? I would know you would say, don't leave your money on the table, but
right.
Even do I keep up the noise and say, buyer, you're going to have to pay me this additional 0.5%? So this is my first time to really have to talk about that.
Yeah, my suggestion would be, if anybody came to my buyer compensation class, I gave some scripts that you can use for that, for both the seller and for the buyer. But one of the things that's very important is if you're doing a CETO, for those of you that are in my market center, Midtown, CETO means come into the office. Now, we live in a new world now of Zoom and meeting at Starbucks and so on and so forth. But whatever that CETO means to you, it's a consultation. That's the time to discuss it, because either the buyer will plan just in case they have to pay you that extra percent, or you always want to start off by saying, I'm going to try to negotiate it with the seller first. And that could be in the form of additional closing costs. That could be in the form of rolling it into the price as long as it appraises, but you got to be careful. What if it doesn't? Now there goes your percentage of compensation. Or third would be, buyer, you may have to come up with that 0.5%. Sometimes a buyer, you don't want to say to a buyer, I'm not going to show you properties that don't pay. A buyer could say that to you. A buyer could say, well, is there an opportunity for you to just show me properties that the seller will pay you? The answer is yes. You're okay to say yes to that. but you want to be very, very careful about steering the buyer to answer a certain question, because you're steering them to say it. The seller, the buyer could also say, well, could you ask the seller to go ahead and pay your commission? Absolutely, you could do that. And of course you can as well. You're not going directly to the seller, you're going to the listing agent. So don't leapfrog the listing agent and ask the seller. You can go directly to the listing agent to say, would you go ahead and pay the commission? Okay. And you never know, when a seller is sitting down with the listing agent, they might decide we're not going to offer anything, but then once they see the offer, you don't know how long the house has been on the market sometimes, or how many times, or that seller woke up on the right side of the bed and said, this is ridiculous. We haven't had a lot of showings. Now we've got this. I'll go ahead and pay, or something like that. So Carrington, you have your hand up.
I was just gonna ask if anyone, like, how do they, like, be as real as possible, of course, with this answer. But if there is a case where your buyer can't afford the 3%, is your level of service going to change? Like, how are we managing? Go ahead.
No, how are you managing? Finish that.
I was gonna say, how are we managing, we know our worth and what we have to offer, and we charge a certain percentage, they can't afford it. So what type of service are we supposed to give them? Are we supposed to give them less? Or we maintain the same thing and just take it as a loss?
So that's where you become an entrepreneur. One of the things in that buyer compensation class that I talked about, and with the classes that I'm going to on a regular, every Friday, I go to a 30-minute class that is constantly talking about this situation that's going on in our industry, just so I can get nuggets to give back to you guys. At the end of the day, the number one problem as to why those lawsuits happened was they were going against antitrust laws, first of all. The second thing is they didn't have a value proposition. See, when you have a value proposition, meaning, buyer, this is what I plan to do when you sign this brokerage engagement. So your level of service, I would highly, and I have to do this as well, I highly recommend that you add your level of services or value proposition on your website. I highly recommend that you add a page to your website of what does it mean to have an agent as a buyer? What does it mean to have an agent as a seller? And you don't want to give away your secrets, but at the end of the day, you want to give them a level of service. And buyer, this is what I'm going to do to protect you. I have a for sale by owner now who I told to be a for sale by owner, and I'll be a transaction broker. And the first offer he received, it's a wholesaler with an assignment. He didn't know any of that. No commission was discussed. And so when I came back to him and I said, they want a 30-day due diligence. They want a 30-day close for cash, by the way. And, oh, no, I'm sorry, 30 business days. It was like, they're offering him lower than what he really wants. And he wants to go with the offer, but I zhuzhed it a little. And I said, here's what we're talking about. And he goes, okay, well, this is why I need you. I'm like, well, we talked about why you needed me and you didn't want to pay me what I wanted to be paid. So therefore, that's why you're for sale by owner right now. And I'm transaction broker. So this is how someone protects. To answer your question, you have to decide what level of service. But the problem is when we sign buyer brokerage, we all, or we sign customer agreements or non-exclusive, we still act like buyer brokerages. Okay, we still act like act like an exclusive. So you have to know, this is what I'm going to do when you're exclusive. This is what I'm going to do when I'm a transaction broker. This is what I'm going to do if you're just I don't represent you at all. You have to be very careful because we always step over the line of reasonable care and go right to exclusive and treat everybody exclusive. Exclusive means you're pulling comps, you're telling them about areas, you're putting the contract together and making suggestions and so on and so forth. Versus a transaction broker, I'm just putting what you want in there. I'll answer the questions, of course, but I'm just putting in the contract what you want in there or what everyone agrees to versus taking it one step. Now, this for sale by owner also has a pre-listing signed with me, but I said, you try for sale by owner first, and then if it doesn't work out, then we'll go to a full exclusive. So to answer your question again, Carrington, is you've got to decide what your level of service is going to be. And then also by using that consumer brochure talking about agency, it also explains. So if you guys don't know what you should put on your marketing materials or your website, grab that, the ABCs of agency, and just look at those different categories. And then plug in how you, as a buyer's agent, seller's agent, transaction broker, are going to behave and offer. Does that help you or confuse you?
It helps me. I'm hearing that there are boundaries I have to create within my business.
Yeah.
Around that. So
yeah. I mean, if you have a consultation first, then you can make a decision. You know, I always like to use the example of going to the doctor because it's very parallel to what we do. You're going to have insurance and they're either going to take it or they're not. You're going to fill out paperwork when you get there and you're going to follow these things, or you can find a new doctor. Okay. So they can choose to work with you or refer you to another doctor and so on and so forth. So you may say, here are my boundaries, but if not, I'd love to refer you to someone else or not work with them at all. I know it's the hardest thing to hear when you say, I'm not going to work with them at all, but I guarantee you it's very liberating. Mika.
And I will say, do it sooner than later. Like start and put these practices into place initially and stick to them so you don't have to backtrack on things. And I know you're on Coffee Talk the other day, Carrington, what Jason even said to me. Follow what your process is, get your process established and do it with everybody. Because as soon as you make an exception to something you usually do, that's when the problems happen. Have your standards, have your boundaries, and what's for you is for you. And I'm saying that to myself too, because like with all of this, there are some things that I have to go back and make sure that I have in place. And I'm talking about on buyer's consultations, because it's going to be real hard when somebody sends you the 5th listing and now it's at 2% and you haven't had the conversation about where that additional 1% is going to come from, or 2% or whatever you charge. So just put it into action now.
Exactly. It was well said. Well said. Does that help you, Carrington?
yes, thank you.
You're very welcome. All right. And then of course, the exclusive buyer brokerage engagement on the second page goes into more detail. It's pretty much the same as the seller, but also for clarity, this shall only exist if it's in the prior written agreement between the seller broker and the commission being offered by the seller's broker to the broker is set forth in multiple listing service. And that broker, meaning that buyer broker to your listing, must be a member. So I don't know about anyone on this particular call, but sometimes we have agents that want to do business in Macon or Augusta. You better make sure you're sending that 258 form that I showed you previous to that agent to make sure they will pay you. If you're not a member of that board, they are not obligated. That's always been. But now it's even more important when you decide, I'm going to work Atlanta and then I'm going to drive an hour and a half to 2 hours and go to Macon and try to make a sale. And you might find out you're not going to be paid. And if not, then will the buyer be paying you? Okay. Also, we have a warning about identity theft. The closing attorneys that I've gone to recently are all talking about with the title insurance, they have some additional servicing they have to do as far as proving identity of all parties before the title company will insure them. In Georgia MLS, they're now offering, I think as of, says October 30th, I think is when they started offering this benefit called Forewarn, where if the scammers love lots or acreage because there's not a house sitting on it, there's not really anybody paying attention. That person could be living in Tennessee and they decide to take the identity of this lot on Main Street, and then you're unsuspecting buyer comes along and says, yeah, I want to make a contract or make an offer on it. They go to closing. All these things that normally are done. And then we find out that the seller wasn't the real seller. They've gone off with the proceeds. And now the real seller shows up to visit their land in Georgia to find out somebody's building a house on it. So this is old school. I mean, we had examples of this in pre-license in 1996. I can't believe we are looking at it again, that it's on the rise. So if you are listing land, please, really, if you're listing anything, please make sure that you are talking to the appropriate people, especially if you're dealing with divorce, probate, bankruptcy, any of those things, and especially vacant properties. These are the type of things where they're seeing it mostly with vacant properties and lots. But you should be checking that anyway. The tax records, that's a great place to start, but it's not always guaranteed. You could go to your favorite closing attorney to say, hey, I'm getting ready to list this property. Can you check for any liens? Can you check and make sure I have the appropriate owners? I'm going to the appointment tomorrow and it's Mr. and Mrs. Smith. And you want to make sure all of that matches, because sometimes the records in MLS and FMLS are not always accurate. I like to go to the tax record online. So say, for instance, you want to know Fulton County, you're going to a listing in Fulton County. You could go to the Fulton County Tax Assessor's office, type in the address or the tax ID number, and all of that should pop up to show who's been paying the taxes. If you have one name, but you're meeting two people, that just probably means they're related in some fashion, whether married or relatives, but maybe only one person is on the deed. And that's who would be the signer. If you're dealing with probate, then you shouldn't be doing anything unless they have their letter of testamentary from Georgia, from the courts, from the probate courts. Okay. The closing attorneys are asking more questions. I did a closing several months ago where it's always been my practice to tell, we've got a list of things that the buyer and seller need to bring to closing. And we just said, ID. Well, when I got there, they started asking for 2 additional pieces of ID. And she was like, oh, well, will you take my Costco card? Whatever. And I forgot what he took, but he did take some additional. And I said, oh, normally I just tell them to bring their driver's license. And that's when he started, before the new contracts came out, he said the title companies are asking for a little bit more to make sure that this person is, and he did ask her some additional questions I've never heard closing attorneys ask. And that is the original person who signed this agreement and you went into contract with, you haven't gone into contract with anyone else. That was new to me, sitting there listening to that. So I don't know if that's across the board for all attorneys or it was just this attorney, dotting his I's and crossing his T's. Has anybody else noticed anything different at their closing tables? No, just me, it figures. All right, let's look at section 200, our purchase and sale agreement. So this is just a minor change. On the first page under earnest money, we used to have 2 or 3 options for delivering earnest money to the holder. Because every holder is different, especially attorneys, if we're going to have the attorney hold it, they typically only want a wire. ACH used to be on here, ACH, wire, cash, not cash, check. Please do not take cash from anyone, and definitely do not make copies of the cash on the copier. I know that sounds silly, but I have seen it done in my career. And one time someone left the money on the copier and I'm going, I don't think so. That's not how this works. So that's also a federal crime to copy money on a copy machine. So do not do it. Earnest money will be paid to the holder in a method acceptable to that holder. So if that holder says, I only want a wire, wire. That holder says, I want a check, check. However they want that done. You still have the 3 options of at the time of offer, within days of binding, and then see if there's something other than that. Keys and openers, this and devices and fixtures was updated. Devices and fixtures is new. Keys and openers have always been there, but they added a couple of things like access cards, codes, and things of that nature, especially for gated communities, communities with amenities that may have different fobs, cards, things of that nature to get into. And then also, if things are conveyed, then they need to be conveyed as soon as possible, when, you know, provided at closing or prior to closing. This is all making this very clear for the seller. I've heard many times people have called me and said, hey, we didn't get this, we didn't get that. When you're going over this contract with the seller, you need to let them know that when they purchase, you need to get all the keys, all the fobs, that type of thing. If they have an HOA and they have to buy those items again, then they need to buy those items to pass on to the new buyer. What I find is that the seller said, this is all I have, and then the buyer ends up having additional costs to get these things in order to operate a gate or you know, the swimming pool gate or something like that. Nothing big, but just being very clear. In the section under earnest money. So when we have a dispute with earnest money in the purchase and sale agreement, there have been times when some of you have called me and, you know, you hate the fact that maybe your buyer is going to lose their earnest money. So I will make the suggestion, we'll see if you guys can split it. There are many of you on this call because I've done it. And I'm not the only one. We've done that in our industry. Well, now this paragraph has been updated to say that whatever the interpretation of the holder, whether it be the brokerage or an attorney, decides, they will not split it, even if you guys want to. If they make a decision it's going to the seller, it's going to the seller. If they make a decision it's going to the buyer, it's going to the buyer. But there won't be a decision to say, you know, 50% to the seller and 50% to the buyer, or dollar amount, or whatever the case may be. So my suggestion would be to make sure we follow all deadlines so no one's losing earnest money, and we go over the contract with the parties to make sure they understand you will be in breach if you do this, and you most likely, the holder will give the earnest money to XYZ. Okay, any questions about this this paragraph about the interpretation? So that's another thing I have to change in my mind, because there are instances where we have worked it out and split it. This is also in the purchase and sale agreement, that we'd have no duty to determine the identities or legitimacy of the party. So, you know, I just talked about forewarn and that type of thing. That's a tool we can use and it's free to us. However, it's not really our responsibility to say that this seller owns this house or this buyer owns the house. Now, to protect your interest in this transaction and in the interest of everyone involved, of course, I don't want to waste my time and find out this was all a scam. I'm going to make sure I'm talking to the appropriate people. But if we get to the end and then realize we've all been scammed, the reason this has been added is because of lawsuits where the person, the agent involved also was named in the lawsuit that you should have known. Well, the person invited me over, said this is their house. I listed it. Every time I went over, they were there, you know, so on and so forth. So we are not Nancy Drew or detectives that we have to figure out, are you who you say you are? That's not our responsibility. So we have no duty to ensure termination. You know why we have no duty? Because in Georgia, it's not a fiduciary state. In other states, that could be an issue for them. That's why I've put that there. So let me say this to you, and it kind of applies to the person that called about the fiduciary. It doesn't mean you can't act in a fiduciary way, but you open yourself up to lawsuit. That's all I'm going to say to that. Rules for interpreting this agreement, the amendatory clause, what was changed in the purchase and sale agreement, and also our FHA and VA exhibits. When you work with an FHA or VA buyer, the lender most likely will have those two parties sign an amendatory clause on top of the financing contingency that we have. The wording in that amendatory clause and our contract now match. They didn't match before. So they've gone back now. It used to be that way, and for whatever reason it changed. Now they've gone back to the same wording. So that's all that you need to know. I've had people call me that want to change in a special stip this amendatory clause. Good luck with that. The amendatory clause shall control no matter what. So if someone says, well, if you're seller or buyer, let's take that amendatory clause out of it. That's not going to happen. Okay, these are government-backed loans, and that's it. It shall control. That's all you need to know about that. Survival of agreement, what was added was section 8 in this paragraph. The section on devices and fixtures, seller liability for not timely removing items from the property that seller agreed to remove. That survives. What would happen is, and this is a tough one because people are like, you know, I got here and there's the pool table in the living room and they were supposed to move it and they didn't. Well, the buyer may have to move it and then sue the seller for the amount. They're going to call you because they want you to do something, and you may be nice and call 1-800-JUNK to come and get it. But technically, that's not your responsibility. A walkthrough should have been done to say that needs to be gone. And if not, then it's going to cost $500 to move it. And we want $500 paid to 1-800-GOT-JUNK at closing if you don't have time to move it, or the buyer ends up moving it when they move in and they'll have to sue the buyer. I'll sue the seller. So I know what really happens in the industry is we end up just going, I don't need this. It's going to cost $200 to move it. Here's the $200 to 1-800-GOT-JUNK. They'll be by tomorrow. But technically what the contract says is that this survives the agreement because they agreed to it in the contract. Okay. And I know everybody on this call has had that situation. If you haven't, you will. Definitions here, we had to have a definition about a closing. So if you have a dry closing, so if you're a new agent to this call and you've not heard that term, that just means we all signed the papers, but things, the funding didn't show up at our designated time. It's late in the afternoon or whatever. So let's just say you closed at 4, but the funds weren't there. Attorney says, go ahead and leave. I'll let you know when I get the funds. And he gets the funds at 5 o'clock. You now have a closing, even though it hasn't been dispersed yet. Okay. So once those funds are there, now, you know, I've joked and said, until the teller says, welcome back, Deborah, it's not a closing. I just say that for fun. But a real closing is when all the documents have been signed and approved by the bank and the funds have been received by the attorney. Now you have a closing. Okay. Whether he has wired the funds to the seller and you is not the issue. It's when he or she receives the funds. That's what that paragraph F says. Any questions about that? When we talk about lots, some additional language has been added, which I'm excited about. How many of you have gone into a contract or gone into the MLS system to see a house listed for like 10 days? Which means, for me, what that means is there's an agreement somewhere, there's an assignment somewhere that says, hey, seller, I'm going to buy your house. But then they find an unsuspecting agent and say, I own this house and I want to get a buyer. And you list it for 10 days, 30 days, whatever they ask you. And then they will turn around and either close with that seller and double close with the next buyer, or they will do an assignment where they're getting an additional fee on top of that. You have to be very careful of that, and our contracts are now very clear that the property cannot be listed in MLS service by the buyer prior to closing, and here's the best part, without the seller's written approval. So the seller could agree to this, and there's a form for it, and I'll show it to you. And then commissions owed are the responsibility of the assignee. So if the assignee does not pay, somebody's going to pay. Okay. Now, there's a new special stip that was added called the seller's consent to assignment of purchase and sale agreement. So that for sale by owner I was telling you about, he's agreed to go ahead and let this buyer assign it. I have to give them this form so I can have it in writing. You know, it's not I don't think it's to his best advantage, but I've advised him on that, and he has said, I'll go ahead and do it. So I've got the form or the special stip that I'll add to the offer this afternoon. Anybody have any questions about this? I've seen this a lot in our MLS system. And I've had investors call me to say, hey, will you list this? And I'm going, do you own it? No, I have it as an assignment. And my answer is no. And here's why. As your broker, I get calls from sellers asking why their house is on Zillow when the agent told them they were buying it. But they didn't tell them they were going to put it in MLS because they didn't have permission to do it either. So now that has been rampant, which is why the contract committee, it was also something I sent into the contract committee as well to say, this is happening quite a bit. Is there anything we can do about it? And so they have done that. I probably wasn't the only one. All right. Anybody run into this? And if you are looking at this going, ooh, I've done that, just shore it up, clean it up, clean up your systems so you don't get in trouble for that or get it kicked out of MLS.
Mrs. Deborah, I've had wholesalers call me before and ask, can I put this in the MLS? And I knew it was wrong and I didn't know why. And I just told them no. Yet now I understand. So that conversation now, a wholesaler calls, hey, Mika, I have this assignment. Can you just put it in MLS for, 10 days?
Do you have the seller's written permission to do that?
There you go. Okay.
That's it. And
Okay.
if they tell you yes, they need to show it to you. If they tell you no, hey, well, if you're not represented, I can be a transaction broker for this transaction and I can get the appropriate paperwork so that the seller gives you permission to do that. And then I can do it. My fee is.
And not to guide them on what to do, but a lot of these the wholesalers I've worked with, they have these contracts already established that they give to the sellers and they're kind of good. So do they need to spell out that they can advertise or?
Yeah. I've seen some that say, you give me the right to advertise and market this property in any fashion. And they mention in it sometimes MLS, in the MLS system. And I've even had complaint calls from a seller. And when they gave me the offer, I said, well, ma'am, you agreed to them doing that. That's why it's showing up in Zillow. I didn't know that. They may be getting the seller to sign it, but they're not reading anything. You and I both know when it comes to a for sale by owner or someone that they've sent, a yellow letter to, and they go, yeah, I want to sell my house if you give me the right price. And then they give them that contract saying, I'm going to buy it, but really they're going to assign it. And when I questioned that person who wrote on my for sale by owner guy, he didn't want to work with the agent. And when I spoke to him and I said, well, I know why you don't want to work with me. Let me tell you why. Are you this, and this? And he was silent. He goes, yes. I said, well, we can still work together. You're just going to do it the right way. So it's you've got the tools. Don't be afraid to question them. The ones that are legit will work with you. The ones that are trying to pull a little fast one will probably go away. And that's probably good for us. Okay. Notice of seller of assignment. So notice to the seller of an assignment of a purchase and sale agreement. So if that wholesaler has decided I'm going to sign this, say for instance, the wholesaler says, I'm going to buy your property, but didn't say anything about an assignment, but then later on says, I'm going to assign it to, this C buyer over here. So there's A, B, C. A is the seller, B is the wholesaler, C is the new buyer. Because the B buyer is no longer the buyer anymore. They're going to assign their rights to C. So if that's the case, then, and it's after the fact, then this form is a new form. It's a unilateral form where the purchase and sale agreement information would be put in, and then the new buyer. And there's 2 sections for new buyer in case there's more than one buyer. But if it's just one, you're going to fill out one side. The original buyer signs and dates it, and then the new buyer signs and dates. This is used after you've gotten written permission from the seller to be able to assign it. And then once you do find that new buyer, you're going to fill this form out. Okay. Agreement to reinstate the contract. This is the same form. The only thing they added was in the event, the way this form works is, say you've gone back and forth, you decided to walk away because you had the right to, during due diligence, to terminate. and then 2 or 3 days later, your buyer says, you know what, that was a good deal. I think I'd like to reinstate that contract. You would just use this form. And the only thing they changed is added was number 4, because if the earnest money has already been returned, that means there's no earnest money, even though you reinstated a contract that says we have earnest money. Then you're going to do this form and then put in that you need to, you'll amend the agreement for new earnest money. And that's where you would put that on number 2. So all the terms that were in place before would remain the same unless you're changing something. Could be the closing date, could be adding earnest money, and then number 4, you would put in that they need to add additional earnest money within so many days of reinstatement date versus binding date. Clear as mud? Section 3 talks about our disclosures. We've added under Section 5, systems and components. Are there any remotely accessible thermostats, lighting fixtures, lighting systems, security cameras? Something we've already talked about. You're going to say yes or no. And if they mark that, and by the way, as listing agents and buyer agents, don't just take this form and slide it over to your client to fill out or slide it to your buyer to sign. You need to read it to make sure, number 1, all the questions have been answered, either yes or no, that apply to that property. And if you see that they've said yes to I, then you need to find out, what do you have? You know, there may be some things that are very clear, like a doorbell video, and so, but there may be some other little hidden things that you don't know about, that they need to tell you about. Flooding, this is a big one that, especially with crawl space homes, where there's been flooding and maybe there have been some things that have been done to keep that from happening. Same thing with basements. And have there been any repairs made that are controlling water intrusion? For instance, did they install a new gutter, or did they install a French drain to keep water from, you know, flowing back against the house or something like that? So that's one of the reasons you would see something like that. Added fiscal or calendar language to address installment payments on our community association disclosure. That's been added because we're monthly, quarterly, semi-annually, and annually sometimes for assessments. And then any other assessment expenses, because or association expenses. These 2 sections were added because different communities are being built now and they have other association expenses. So please, when you're working with anything with an association, you want to ask these questions, especially for those of us that are in the heart of Atlanta, of in-town, midtown, Decatur, you know, that type of thing, where those type of properties are built and may have additional fees. All of this is just added clarification language. We kind of talked about it already. If a seller has an undisclosed special assessment, we're not held liable for that. It's only if they've received notification from the HOA that it's under consideration and we're going to vote on it. If it's just under consideration conversation, nobody's obligated to say anything about it. Financing, we pretty much talked about the FHA and VA change, but under all of the loan contingencies, we've removed the column that talked about the institution, whether it's an institutional bank or private money or things of that nature. It really served no purpose, and so finally it was removed, just to clean the form up. Everything else is the same. Appraisal contingency. If the buyer does not seek a reduction in the sales price, they are obligated to pay for that house for the contract amount. So if the buyer does not seek a sales price reduction, for instance, if it appraises for $300, but the sales price is $350, and they don't seek out the price reduction, then they are obligated to pay the $350. So please be careful on that. You seem to have a problem with that. This I already talked about, the amendatory clause, so I won't waste time on that. We already talked about it. Loan assumptions. I started talking to all of you about loan assumptions maybe 2 years ago because I could see where we were going with the interest rates going up. And for someone who's been in the business as long as I have, loan assumptions were common. They went away because rates were low, inventory was high, and we really didn't have to look at it. So the loan assumption form had not been touched for about 15, 20 years. So now that it's becoming popular again, now this form has added just different things that the bank may ask of that buyer to make sure that they qualify for the loan and that new rate. So if you're not familiar with assumptions, our rates are somewhere between the high sixes, maybe mid fives right now, but we have a lot of people out there that want to sell that might have one of those great 2020 rates of 2 and 3%. And as long as your buyer can qualify for that, they can assume that. Now they would have to have the equity in order to buy out that seller. So they couldn't just say, oh, I'm going to do an FHA and put 3.5% down to get your 2%. No, they'd have to have the 50,000 to pay that seller in order to get that wonderful rate. So for those that might be that are not cash poor, this type of creative financing for them would be great. But if they're cash poor, chances are they wouldn't be able to do a loan assumption. And a loan assumption is still good for FHA, VA, USDA, and there are some other forms of financing that we don't do that much, so I didn't bring those up, but there are others. You do not have to be a vet to qualify for a VA assumption, by the way. I know that was kind of new to some ears. This is what I just explained is right here. Everything I said it in bullet points, but it's the same thing right here.
Deborah, this is Christine. Can I ask a quick question?
You go right ahead.
So if I understand this correctly, with a loan assumption, you always have to come up with the rest from the remaining loan amount to the purchase price as a
Well,
buyer.
whatever you negotiated. Yeah, whatever you negotiated. So if that equity is, $50,000, then they're going to be bringing more to the table than the typical 3.5% or 10% or whatever.
Okay, I got that. And could the buyer take a personal loan or some form of other loan if they don't have enough cash?
That would be a question that you'd ask the loan officer. That's not something that's typically done because you don't want to take out any loans when you're trying to get a mortgage loan. So I don't want to say that couldn't be done. It depends on the creditworthiness of that particular client.
Okay, good. Thank you.
You're welcome. All of this is new. This is talking about a loan denial letter for this assumption, the right to request evidence of the buyer's ability to close, which means do they have the money in order to close on this, and then the seller's right to terminate if they don't provide that evidence. So please understand that if you're going to do a loan assumption, these number 10, 11, and 12 are key factors in all of this. And then also the bank that is going to do the assumption, you don't have your typical closing costs, for those of you that have never done it before, that you would with a regular loan, because a regular loan, you're getting a new loan, which is why we have closing costs. With this type of loan, you'll still have small closing costs, but the first one I ever did was in Powder Springs, and the closing costs were $1,500, and it was an FHA. So compared to, they could have been, $7,000 or $8,000. And really all of it is just changing the names and, all clerical stuff, administrative stuff. So make sure you read all of those. And then the rest is leasing. If you are into doing a lot of leasing, some of this was just cleaned up with the words prior. Things need to be done prior to, not after the fact. That's all that was done there. Administrative fees can be charged. No subletting, and tenant shall not be given an opportunity to cure. So let's say you have a landlord and that tenant has been subletting, and they go, oh, I'm so sorry, that was my bad, I didn't know, blah, blah, blah. The seller could say, sorry, you're out of here. The leasing agreement says you can't sublet, and you have done that. And so we're giving you notice, and the tenant shall not be given any opportunity to cure. Could that be changed with a special stip? Yes, because a special stip overrides. But if you have somebody doing that, they could be jeopardizing the property. If it's an HOA community that doesn't allow, that type of thing, or Airbnb or whatever, they could be putting the property in jeopardy. So it's just been put in here, no subletting. Holding over fees, they shall not remain in the property unless they pay holdover fees. And if there's any destruction to the property, act of God, things of that nature, the landlord will say, okay, you're gonna have to move out. When you move out, it'll be no more than X amount of days. And this is what I'm gonna do in the event you have to relocate and then come back. Or if they cannot do that, the tenant would have the right to break their lease. And we have a new form for that, and it's called the property damage liability. And it's either going to be option 1 or option 2, where they can elect to make sure that they have renter's insurance, and also if they're going to have an alternate program for the lease in the event you have any kind of property damage liability. And then our final one, I'm in love with this new one, because if you've ever given a referral and it was an in-house pay, meaning you sent a listing and the listing agent in Alabama sold it in-house, meaning they brought the buyer and the seller. We had another line that says, I get 50% of the commission. For some reason, everyone interpreted 50% means 50%. I don't know what was so confusing, but it was. And some people got scammed out of not getting their 50% or whatever the case may be. That has been removed from this broker to broker referral agreement. And now if you're sending something to someone that's a listing and that seller is also going to buy, you're going to put whatever percentage you want from both of those sides of the commission, so that there's no confusion. Okay. Also, I don't know why this is confusing. Commissions or compensation is broker to broker. We as agents say mine, including me, but it's paid to the brokerage, and then the broker pays us as independent contractors. Your broker form should be signed by the broker, because if there's a problem, same thing with leases. You know, I get more calls about leases not being paid than the referrals not being paid. And then also it's your responsibility to follow up, check and see, how's that listing going? You sold it yet? And because it's been just rampant in our office where people are not getting their money. Or a check will be sitting in Annie's office with no address on it. So you want to make sure you pay attention to that. And it also needs to go into command, so that if it does come in and it has an address on it or has your name on it, and it will be able to go into command and say, hey, so-and-so, it looks like I got your referral check today. Okay, so no more confusing 50% language. You will now insert the percentage of the total in-house commission you want on both sides. Even if you're not sure if that seller is going to buy, I'd still put a percentage in there, because they could decide to lease, you still should get a commission. Or they could decide they're moving somewhere else. Now you want to refer them to someone else. So just make sure that you read this carefully and you understand it. Okay. Questions? I think we went just a tad over. Any questions? Let me see. There's something in chat. Somebody said I'm victim to this. But we got it straightened out, Carrington. Any questions?
Deborah, this is Kim. I just have one question.
Sure.
Back when you were talking about the assignments, I have yet to work with any investors or wholesalers, and I just wanted to know, what does the assignment actually mean?
So let's say you and I are working together. You're the seller,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm the wholesaler. And I say to you, Kim, I'm going to buy your house. You go, great, sign me up. But meanwhile, I'm looking for a new buyer to take over my interest. We're using the word assignment, but it's really, you're going to take over my interest. So I'm buying your house for $200,000, but I've sold my interest to this other person for $250,000. They say, I'll take that deal for $250,000. And now when I close with you, I'm going to close at $200,000. And then I'm going to close with this person, C. Remember I said A, B, C.
Mm-hmm.
Close with the C person for $250,000. And I'm going to put $50,000 in my pocket.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
The problem has been when a seller doesn't know that's gone on. I walked into a closing one time where I didn't know my wholesaler made a switch. and I don't work with that wholesaler anymore. And when I got there, everyone was hot mad. I didn't know why. And it was because the seller found out that an additional whatever, I don't remember the amount, it wasn't that much, it was a small property, but they were upset because they felt like they left money on the table. Why should you get it when I could have gotten it? But you agreed to this, but they didn't know it. That's why it has to be disclosed. That's why it has to be in writing.
That makes sense.
And they were upset and they didn't want to close, but they were stuck. They had to, or they would have been in breach. So luckily, the closing attorney I was working with also owns what's called transactional money. Transactional money is temporary money you can use for a day, for an hour, for a week to close on a transaction and then turn around and close on the other. You pay a lot of money for that money. You might pay double digits for that money for obvious reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? Good questions today. Thank you for participating. I thought you guys were going to be wah, wah. Somebody sent me a cartoon today and said, "Ooh, it's been a year." And the other person in the cartoon says, "Girl, it's only January." That's how I feel. So does everybody feel like we've had a whole year in just January and it's only the 22nd? I do. All right. Any questions, Adam? You've been quiet today. No? Adam's on top of it.
No, ma'am, this is a good refresher, so thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. And everybody's teaching it different. The only thing I didn't go over is grammatical errors, sentences, stuff like that. You know, you can look at the changes to see that. And then I didn't go over anything commercial, but and I didn't go over anything leasing management because most of you on this call are not doing that. So if you're curious about it, you can go back and look at it. I just gave you the things that you use most likely on a daily basis. All right, you guys. Well, we're at the end of Broker Chat. We've gone over a little bit, but I appreciate, oh, Carrington had her hand up one more time. Go ahead, Carrington.
Sorry, one last thing.
Sure.
I recently saw it's a newer agent. She's at a different brokerage, and she uses GAR forms, but they look like the outdated ones. Are we still able to use the outdated contracts, or if I wanted to send her our most updated ones, would that work better?
Your conversation should be this: hey, you know what, co-op agent, I really appreciate the fact that you sent this offer over. My broker is going to require me to use the most recent 2024 contracts. Do you mind if I redo the contract? However, there is nothing wrong with mixing contracts, but the problem is you have an independent contract agreement with us that you will always use the most updated contracts. So if someone sends you something like the RE forms, you know, those other weird forms that are in there, sometimes people are not realtors, they're salespeople, so they don't have access to GAR without paying for it. So that just means she's with a brokerage that didn't pay for the 2024, so she's using whatever she has. And the reason why you want to use the most updated is because it's for protection. It's for protection for all parties. So there are things in the 2023 that are not in, or things that are in the 2024 that are not in whatever year she's using. So you just counter her with the new forms.
Okay, thank you.
Good question. Anything else, you guys? All right, well, have a great day. Go write lots of contracts and Happy New Year.
Thank you.
Thank you. Happy New Year.